Welcome to Sold with Webinars, a podcast that aims to uncover how the most successful experts, coaches, consultants, and e-course professionals sell their products and services with just one sales presentation or webinar. A simple sales webinar can transform the business and life of a solopreneur. And this podcast will show you how other experts just like you are generating 6 and 7 figures per year online with their webinars. So let's get started. Hey, what's going on, experts? It's Joel here with another episode of Sold with Webinars. Today, I had a solo podcast for you that you are absolutely going to love. Guys, if I can literally hand you millions of dollars right now, this episode is going to be it. Over the course of the past, let's just say 2 years, I've been really focused on trying to figure out how to implement and develop stories that sell. And that is way too broad for me. And it's probably way too broad for you, right? If you've been following marketing for any length of time, you've probably heard that phrase in some form or another. Today, I went in and dissected it and tried to show you how to reverse engineer an effective metaphor, okay? Metaphors sell way more than specific stories. I reverse engineered how to think about metaphors, how to create metaphors, and how to use them to convert more of your customers on webinars and all of your marketing. So without further ado, let's jump into today's episode. Hey, what's going on, expert? Joel here, and welcome to another episode of Sold with Webinars. I'm going to hop on the horn today. We're going to do a little bit of a lesson here, and I want to talk about something very, very important as it relates to you increasing your conversions in your webinars and in your marketing in general. Whenever I work with a client, and let's just take an example that they call me up, they say, Joel, I've got an existing webinar that I want you to improve, and I'm going to make the assumption that they're making 0 conversions with their webinar. So I'll watch their webinar and I'll go through their intake form and intake process, and I'll try and connect the dots. Where is your prospect before they sign up for your webinar, and where do you ultimately want them to be at the end? I can probably, with a relatively high level of certainty, guarantee that these people who are making 0 conversions on their webinars, and I don't want to sound general and I don't want to sound broad, because if you have been studying marketing for a while, you've probably had people tell you that you need to tell stories. Okay, great. That sounds awesome. But what on earth does it mean to be able to tell stories, tell effective stories? When I would train copywriters and we were growing our agency business, our done for you side, I would work with copywriters on the importance of creating metaphors. Now, the word metaphor may or may not mean anything to you, but it is the ability to relate complex topics with something tangible that your audience can understand. When you fall victim to the expert's curse, which is you get way too complicated with how smart you are, and you want to teach your prospect, teach your audience everything under the sun, we fall into the expert's curse and we confuse our prospects. This is a perfect example. Let me give you a perfect example. When I was back in engineering sales, I was selling commercial heating and cooling equipment to engineers and contractors. The expert's curse was very apparent and our sales were abysmal, meaning we would have manufacturers stand up and they would just talk all sorts of techno jargon. If we were selling variable frequency drives, they were just boring our audience to death. And on the surface, we would think that that shouldn't happen, right? As we're going through, I'm an engineer and I'm speaking to engineers, so you think that you want to impress them with how much you know. But when it comes to sales and converting your prospect into believing that they should be buying your product or service, the last thing in the world that you want to do is impress them with how much you know. The only thing they care about is what is it going to do for me? And if you have complicated techno jargon, and if you have complicated information, they are not going to understand what the true benefits are. So that's what happened with my engineering days. So now let's fast forward, because a lot of times people in the info marketing space fall victim to this as well. And even though it may not be as technical as engineering jargon, they are still complicating and overcomplicating the message to their prospect. So how do we fix this? How do we create and tell stories and analogies and metaphors that make huge impact? So I was going through and I was doing some reading and I came across a book called Metaphors We Live By. I'm going to give it credit because this is then the best example that I've come across that explains how important it is to tell metaphors, right? And so as I was going through and I was reading, I made some notes here. And the way that we have been able to successfully convey these messages, and I'm all about codifying and reverse engineering what works really, really well. And if I go back to all of our high-performing multi-million-dollar webinars, they will have some form of very strong metaphor or analogy that paints a complex topic and simplifies it, okay? So the real question is, how do we repeat this process? How do we create metaphors? I remember when I was going through my teachings, I would mention this. I'm like, you need to talk about metaphors, like come up with ideas, come up with topics that relate this complex idea to a simple one. And while I can say that, if I can't teach what that actually means, it's going to fall on deaf ears. So here's how I want you to think about it. The best metaphors that I can remember are those that are of spatial existence and those that are either part of a journey or a path, okay? So why does that work? We can point to things when we speak. Let's start with spatial existence or containers. Everything in terms of comprehension can be simplified when we can point to it. Here's what I mean by that. If I tell you that, if I ask you to imagine walking through your house, immediately you'll be able to see it, okay? As you're going through your house or your apartment, you know that there is your total space, your house, your apartment is divided into different compartments, different rooms. It's divided into subcategories. So you've got your large space, which is your house, and then inside of that, you have different rooms or different containers, okay? So inside of that big container, which is your house or your apartment, you have different sub-containers. Now, those sub-containers are what we call your content, and every piece of content is what makes up that big container. So here's what I mean by that, okay? So let's talk about an example. So let's say that your webinar is the house, okay? So your webinar is the overall mechanism that you're using to convert your prospect into a sale. And now I can relate to this webinar as, let's just say, a house. And I tell you that your webinar has to include different components. And each component is going to be described differently, meaning you'll have your 3 or 4 pieces of core content, then you've got your introduction, then you've got your close and your conclusion, and I can break it down into even more subcategories, but I'm not going to. I want to use this just as an example. So let's talk about your house now. Every house or most houses that I've been in have a kitchen, they have a bathroom, they have a living room, they've got bedrooms, they've got family rooms, and they've got closets. Now I can point to everything in there and I can give them descriptions. What is happening inside of your kitchen? Well, inside the kitchen, that's where we host parties in the kitchen and we eat dinner and we cook and we have these different experiences that come up when you think about the kitchen in your house. Same thing with bedrooms, same things with family rooms and game rooms, right? So now we have this space, which is your house, and we have different subspaces that have different sub-emotions, okay? So I'm just going through this off the top of my head, but if I can relate now the webinar to a house, now things start to relate to each other. And I could say, okay, listen, when you are going into your close, I want you to think about that like you're on your back patio grilling steak, right? You crank it up high, and you crank up your grill and you preheat it, right? And this isn't really going to make sense, but what I'm trying to say is this, like understanding like how to point to common similarities and tie in the overall themes, right? So if I'm going through it, I'm trying to explain how to close a sale on a webinar, I'm going to relate that to turning up the heat or, doing something exciting in a specific room, because that room extracts the same emotions as my close inside of the webinar. Does that make sense? Right? I literally just came up, it's probably a terrible example, but I literally just came up with that off the top of my head. I'm trying to explain to you that the type of metaphor that you should think about if you're having trouble creating these metaphors, think about containers. And containers are your arguments, and your argument is what you're trying to get them to believe. Your argument is your container, okay? Your argument is your container. That's one form of metaphor, is relating to a container. So your house is a container. The backyard could be a container. You can even just look at a sub-container and use that as a container and look at the different components. Think about your office, and when you walk into your office, there's in what happens as you're walking through there. You have bookshelves, you have a computer desk, right? Like, this is how you create metaphors, by relating them to spatial containers. Okay, so the other form of argument, the other form of metaphor that you can speak to is the journey, right? Now, the journey is simply just a path that you are on. And the longer the path, the more surface area there is from point A to point B. And you can relate your stories, you can relate your experiences to that journey. And the longer that path is, the more surface area there is to cover. And again, what do you think is between point A and point B? That's your content. That surface area that you are walking along that path is the content that you create. Okay, so your journey is all about progress, and your container is all about the content. So as you are thinking about these stories that you want to tell to get your audience to make those pivot points, those shifts within their mind, I want you to think about, how can I think about a container, and how can I relate a container, what's inside of that, to different elements within my story to make difficult, complex situations simple and easy to understand. So here is what I want you to do to practice this. I want you over the course of the next week, over today, tomorrow, as long as you want, I want you to open your eyes, and I want you to just look at the different containers that you walk into, and the different journeys and the different paths that you walk along, to figure out how you can try and relate that to your arguments of what you're trying to get your audience to believe. The more you're aware of it, the more opportunities will present themselves to relate that to simple, digestible stories that get your audience to come closer to you and say, wow, I get it. I know exactly what you're talking about, right? This is the difference between effective sales presentations and people who go up into your presentation and say, okay, there are 10 steps that you need to do in order to make $1 million online. Step number 1, pick an audience. Step number 2, pick a niche. Step number 3, do this, 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 and this, right? That's the difference between $1 million webinars and people who go broke trying to sell their stuff online. Does that make sense? Awesome. So your life is all about metaphors. Your business is all about metaphors and relating all of your stories to simple, actionable exercises that make it simple and easy to understand. If you can speak about the complex in simple terms, you're gold. That is the absolute number one skill I truly believe that you can ever acquire in the world of business. Okay, that is what I've got for you today. I want you to take action. Take action on that exercise that I gave you. Take action on that challenge that I gave you, and I'll see you all on the next episode. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll talk soon. Thanks so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed today's episode, and we look forward to giving you the next one. If you're serious about launching your own sales webinar, here are a few resources to check out. For free access to the software that we built internally for the webinar agency to train our copywriters, head to soldwithwebinars.com to sign up for a free trial to the Webinar Vault and get access to regular webinar breakdowns that are generating hundreds of thousands of dollars per month. If you'd like to work with me one-on-one on your webinar project, head to thewebinaragency.com for more details. And finally, be sure to subscribe to my other podcast, Experts Unleashed, where I interview changemakers and entrepreneurs to discover how they create opportunity to turn their expertise into income. Be sure to join us next time, and I'll see you there.